Good evening, I'm Professor Nouriel Bremer, and tonight we're diving deep into one of the most consequential geopolitical crises of our time, Venezuela. But I'm not here to talk about the latest headlines or personality conflicts. I'm here to show you how a century of oil dependency created the structural forces that make Venezuela's current crisis not just predictable, but inevitable. Most observers focus on individual leaders, Maduro's authoritarianism, Chavez's populism, opposition politics, but that's missing the forest for the trees. Venezuela's crisis is a textbook case of what economists call the resource curse, and understanding it is crucial for anyone trying to comprehend modern geopolitics, energy security, and why great power competition increasingly centers on resource access. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand why removing any individual leader was never going to solve Venezuela's fundamental problems, why U.S. sanctions backfired spectacularly, and why this crisis represents a broader shift in how resource wealth shapes international relations in the 21st century. Let me take you back to February 14, 1922. Caribbean Petroleum Company's drilling crew strikes oil at the Barrancas field near Lake Maracaibo. It's not just any discovery, it's a gusher producing 100,000 barrels per day, the largest oil strike in history at that point. Within months, the global oil giants descend on Venezuela like a gold rush. Royal Dutch Shell, Gulf Oil, Standard Oil, later known as Exxon, acquire vast concessions across the Maracaibo Basin. By 1924, just 2 years after that first strike, Venezuela is producing 140,000 barrels per day. By 1928, that number reaches 289,000 barrels daily, making Venezuela the world's leading oil exporter. This isn't gradual economic development, this is economic shock therapy. Venezuela goes from regional obscurity to global significance in less than 6 years. The speed of this transformation is crucial to understanding everything that follows, because rapid resource wealth doesn't build institutions, it overwhelms them. Let me put these numbers in perspective. In 1920, Venezuela's entire federal budget was roughly $12 million. By 1925, oil royalties alone generated $3 million annually for the government. By 1929, that figure reached $30 million. In less than a decade, oil transformed the Venezuelan state from a poor Caribbean republic into a major player in global energy markets. But here's what's critical. This wealth was controlled by foreign companies and a tiny Venezuelan elite. By 1929, 3 companies, Shell, Gulf Oil, and Standard Oil, controlled 99% of Venezuelan oil production. The Venezuelan government received royalties and taxes, but the operational control, the technical expertise, and the lion's share of profits flowed abroad. During World War II, this dynamic intensified. Venezuela became the arsenal of energy for the Allied powers. Production increased 42% between 1943 and 1944 alone. U.S. refineries on the Gulf Coast were specifically designed to process Venezuelan crude. By 1945, Venezuela was supplying 15% of global oil production. The money was intoxicating. During the war boom, Venezuelan government revenues reached levels unimaginable just 2 decades earlier. But this created the first iteration of what would become Venezuela's defining political dynamic: immense wealth controlled by whoever could control the oil infrastructure. By the 1940s, Venezuela was experiencing what economists now recognize as classic symptoms of the resource curse. Agricultural production collapsed as labor shifted to the oil fields. Cities expanded rapidly as rural populations migrated toward oil infrastructure. The country that had once fed itself was now importing food. In 1943, President Isaias Medina Angarita enacted the Hydrocarbons Law, the first major assertion of state control over oil revenues. This law mandated a 50-50 profit split between foreign companies and the Venezuelan government, and required all concessions to revert to state control within 40 years. Foreign oil executives predicted disaster. They warned that government interference would destroy Venezuela's oil industry. but production continued increasing because the geological wealth was simply too massive to ignore. What the 50-50 split revealed, however, was something more important than immediate revenue flows. Oil wealth creates irresistible political pressure. Whoever controlled the government now controlled access to billions in oil revenue, and whoever controlled oil revenue could finance political power indefinitely. This dynamic, oil revenue funding the state controlling access to oil wealth, political power consolidating around resource control, became the pattern that would define Venezuelan politics for the next 80 years. During the 1950s, military dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez used oil revenues to fund massive infrastructure projects. Caracas transformed into a modern metropolis virtually overnight. The nation built highways, airports, housing complexes, and government buildings on a scale that rivaled developed European nations. But this apparent prosperity masked a fundamental structural weakness. Venezuela was becoming what political scientists call a rentier state, a country that derives the majority of its revenue from renting out natural resources rather than from taxing a productive, diversified economy. In a normal democracy, governments need productive citizens. They have incentives to educate people, build competitive industries, create conditions for broad-based economic growth because their revenue depends on taxing productive activity. But in a rentier state, the government just needs to control the resource. Citizens become recipients of state largesse rather than generators of state revenue. By 1958, when democracy was restored, oil accounted for over 85% of Venezuela's export earnings and more than 60% of government revenues. The economy had become a single point of failure. When oil prices rose, everything worked. When they fell, the entire system collapsed. Venezuela's role in founding OPEC in 1960 represents a crucial turning point in global energy geopolitics. Venezuelan oil minister Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, alarmed by chronically low oil prices throughout the 1950s, proposed coordinating with other oil-producing nations to stabilize prices and assert collective control over global oil markets. This wasn't just about economics, it was about sovereignty. For decades, oil prices had been set by a cartel of Western oil companies known as the Seven Sisters. Producing countries had no control over the value of their most important asset. OPEC represented an attempt to reverse that power dynamic. The timing was significant. This was the height of decolonization, the Cold War was intensifying, and developing nations were asserting control over their natural resources. Venezuela, despite never having been formally colonized, was asserting economic sovereignty over its oil wealth. During the 1960s, Venezuelan governments began implementing no more concessions policies, refusing to grant new exploration rights to foreign companies while gradually increasing tax rates on existing operations. Oil revenues grew from $1.2 billion in 1960 to $2.3 billion in 1970, even as production remained relatively stable. But the real transformation came with the 1973 oil crisis. When Arab producers imposed an oil embargo during the Yom Kippur War, global oil prices quadrupled almost overnight. Venezuelan oil revenues exploded from $3.8 billion in 1973 to $9.7 billion in 1974. Suddenly, Venezuela was awash in more money than its government had ever imagined. President Carlos Andrés Pérez launched what he called the Great Venezuela Project, massive state investment in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and industrial development. The government nationalized the iron industry, created state-owned enterprises, and began planning the nationalization of oil. This wealth created an illusion of infinite prosperity. Venezuelan officials spoke confidently about transforming their country into a developed nation within a generation. The phrase, "Está como Venezuela," it's like Venezuela, became synonymous with abundance throughout Latin America. But abundance can be more dangerous than scarcity because it obscures structural vulnerabilities. Oil revenues allowed the Venezuelan government to avoid making difficult economic choices. Instead of building competitive industries or investing in education and technology, the state simply distributed oil wealth through subsidies, public employment, and infrastructure spending. By 1975, Venezuela had the highest per capita income in Latin America and one of the highest globally. Yet this prosperity was entirely dependent on maintaining high oil prices and high production levels, two variables largely outside Venezuelan control. On January 1st, 1976, the Venezuelan oil industry was officially nationalized. President Carlos Andrés Pérez signed Law 796, transferring ownership of all oil operations to the Venezuelan state and creating Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., PDVSA, as the national oil company. Foreign companies that had invested over $5 billion in Venezuelan oil infrastructure received what was diplomatically described as marginal compensation. The era of direct foreign control was over, but the era of oil dependency was just beginning. Initially, nationalization appeared to be a stunning success. PDVSA's leadership retained most of the technical expertise from the foreign companies. Venezuelan petroleum engineers were among the most skilled in the world. The company maintained production levels, managed complex logistics, and even expanded operations into refining and petrochemicals. By the 1980s, PDVSA was operating refineries in the Caribbean, Europe, and the United States. It owned Citgo, a major U.S. refining and retail operation. The company had become a vertically integrated oil giant, controlling everything from exploration to retail sales across multiple continents. But nationalization also meant that PDVSA's revenue didn't go to private shareholders. It went directly to the Venezuelan government. And that created an irresistible temptation for every administration to use PDVSA as a source of funding for political projects. During the 1980s, this dynamic came under severe stress when global oil prices collapsed. The price per barrel fell from over $30 in 1980 to less than $10 in 1986. Venezuelan government revenues plummeted by more than 60% in 6 years. The response was instructive. Rather than diversifying the economy or reducing dependence on oil revenue, Venezuelan governments borrowed heavily against future oil production. External debt increased from $11 billion in 1978 to $35 billion by 1988. When oil prices recovered in the late 1980s and early 1990s, PDVSA's management pushed for greater operational autonomy. They argued that political interference was undermining the company's efficiency and that PDVSA needed to operate more like a private corporation. This led to an expansion program called the Apertura, the Opening, which invited foreign companies back into Venezuela through joint ventures and service contracts. Production increased from 2.1 million barrels per day in 1990 to 3.3 million barrels per day by 1998. But the Apertura also created political tensions because it reduced the government's direct control over oil revenues. As oil flowed to joint venture partners and service companies, less money flowed directly to the treasury. This set the stage for a political confrontation that would reshape Venezuela's oil industry and, ultimately, destroy its productive capacity. Hugo Chávez's election in 1998 represented more than a change in government. It represented a fundamental reordering of Venezuelan political priorities. Chávez ran on a platform of using oil wealth to fund social programs for Venezuela's poor majority, and he meant it. During his first term, tensions with PDVSA's management escalated steadily. The company's executives, many of whom were technocrats educated in the United States and Europe, operated according to commercial logic. They wanted to maximize production, minimize costs, and reinvest profits in infrastructure and technology. Chávez had different priorities. He wanted to use oil revenues to fund social programs immediately. He wanted PDVSA to hire more Venezuelans, even if they lacked technical qualifications. He wanted the company to sell oil at subsidized rates to friendly nations and to poor communities in the United States as a form of diplomatic outreach. The confrontation reached a breaking point in 2002. PDVSA management participated in a general strike aimed at forcing Chávez from office. For 64 days, oil production virtually stopped. Venezuela, which normally exported 3 million barrels per day, was importing gasoline. Chavez's response was swift and decisive. He fired approximately 18,000 PDVSA employees, nearly half the company's workforce. These weren't random layoffs. The dismissed workers included petroleum engineers with decades of experience, geologists who understood Venezuela's complex oil fields, refinery operators who knew how to process heavy crude, and logistics specialists who managed global supply chains. They were replaced with political loyalists selected primarily for their support of the Bolivarian Revolution. Technical competence became secondary to political reliability. The company that had once been among the most professionally managed oil enterprises in the world became a patronage machine. The immediate effects were catastrophic. Production plummeted from 3.2 million barrels per day in 2001 to 2.3 million barrels per day in 2003. Refinery capacity declined as maintenance was deferred and technical knowledge was lost. Equipment failures increased exponentially as experienced operators were replaced with politically loyal but inexperienced workers. But for several years, these problems were masked by rising oil prices. Between 2003 and 2008, oil prices increased from $25 per barrel to over $100 per barrel. Despite declining production, Venezuelan oil revenues reached record levels, over $90 billion in 2008 alone. This windfall allowed Chavez to fund an unprecedented expansion of social programs. The missions, as they were called, provided healthcare, education, housing, and food subsidies to millions of Venezuelans. Poverty rates declined significantly. Chavez's approval rating soared. But the revenue was being consumed rather than invested. Instead of reinvesting profits in oil infrastructure, maintaining equipment, or developing new fields, the government diverted PDVSA revenues directly to social spending. The company became a cash cow for political programs rather than a business focused on sustainable production. Between 2003 and 2013, PDVSA transferred over $100 billion to the Venezuelan treasury for social programs and government operations. This wasn't profit sharing or taxation. This was direct diversion of revenues that should have been reinvested in maintaining and expanding production capacity. The consequences became apparent when oil prices began falling in 2014. Production had been declining steadily since 2005, masked by high prices that maintained revenue levels. But when prices dropped from over $100 per barrel to under $30 per barrel between 2014 and 2016, the dual crisis of declining production and declining prices created a perfect storm. Let me give you specific numbers to illustrate the scale of this collapse. In 1998, when Chavez took office, Venezuela produced 3.5 million barrels per day. By 2013, when Chavez died, production had fallen to 2.8 million barrels per day. By 2018, it was 1.5 million barrels per day. By 2020, production had collapsed to just 700,000 barrels per day. This represents a decline of 80% in 2 decades in a country sitting atop the world's largest proven oil reserves. This wasn't natural depletion. This was institutional destruction. The human cost was staggering. Hyperinflation reached 1,000% annually by 2018. Basic medicines disappeared from hospitals. Food became scarce in supermarkets. The electricity grid, dependent on oil revenues for maintenance, began failing regularly. Water systems broke down. Transportation infrastructure deteriorated. By 2020, over 5 million Venezuelans had fled the country, the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Those who remained faced conditions resembling a humanitarian emergency rather than a middle-income petrostate. This collapse wasn't accidental. It was the predictable outcome of subordinating technical competence to political loyalty, of consuming oil revenues rather than investing them, of treating PDVSA as a political instrument rather than a commercial enterprise. Now we need to understand how Venezuela became a focal point for great power competition between the United States and China, because this dynamic shaped both the crisis and the international response to it. During the 2000s, Venezuela exported approximately 1.2 million barrels per day to the United States. American refineries on the Gulf Coast were specifically designed to process Venezuelan heavy crude. Despite political tensions between Chavez and successive U.S. administrations, oil trade continued because both countries benefited economically. But Chavez also used oil as a diplomatic weapon. He sold petroleum at subsidized rates to Caribbean nations, to poor communities in the United States, and to allies like Cuba. He formed Petro-Caribe, an energy alliance that provided favorable financing terms to regional neighbors. He positioned Venezuela as leader of an anti-American bloc in Latin America. The Obama administration initially responded with targeted sanctions focused on individual Venezuelan officials accused of human rights violations. These measures were largely symbolic and had minimal economic impact. Under Trump, sanctions escalated dramatically. In 2017, the U.S. imposed financial sanctions preventing Venezuela from accessing American debt markets. In 2018, sanctions targeted PDVSA directly, freezing the company's U.S. assets and prohibiting American companies from doing business with Venezuelan oil operations. By 2019, the U.S. had imposed a near-total embargo on Venezuelan oil imports, cutting off Venezuela's largest customer and primary source of hard currency revenue. The logic was straightforward. Cut off oil revenue, the government collapses, democracy returns. But that's not what happened. Instead, Venezuela redirected its oil exports to alternative customers. China, which had been providing loans to Venezuela since 2007, became the primary destination for Venezuelan crude. India, with its large refining capacity, began purchasing Venezuelan oil at steep discounts. A network of dark fleet tankers, ships that operate outside normal commercial channels, emerged to transport sanctioned oil to willing buyers. The oil kept moving, just not to the United States. And the buyers who replaced American refineries were willing to pay only discounted prices, which further reduced Venezuelan government revenues. More importantly, sanctions pushed Venezuela deeper into China's economic orbit. When Western financial systems became inaccessible, Venezuela embraced Chinese payment systems. When American companies ceased operations, Chinese firms filled the void. When U.S. technology became unavailable, Venezuela turned to Chinese alternatives. To understand why sanctions failed to achieve their objectives, we need to understand China's approach to energy security. China's economy requires massive amounts of imported energy, over 10 million barrels per day of oil imports alone. As China's economy grew, securing reliable energy supplies became a strategic priority. Starting in 2007, China began extending large-scale loans to Venezuela, with repayment structured in oil deliveries rather than cash. By 2016, Chinese lending to Venezuela exceeded $60 billion, making China Venezuela's largest creditor. This wasn't charity, this was strategic resource planning. China was diversifying its energy suppliers to ensure that no single disruption could paralyze its economy. Partnerships with Russia, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Angola, and Venezuela meant that China could continue importing oil even if any individual supplier was disrupted. When U.S. sanctions cut Venezuela off from Western markets, China provided an alternative. Venezuelan oil that could no longer reach American refineries was redirected to Chinese facilities. Chinese financial institutions replaced Western banks. Chinese technology companies replaced American suppliers. From China's perspective, this was ideal. Sanctions created opportunities to purchase discounted oil from desperate sellers. Countries locked out of Western systems embraced Chinese alternatives. Economic pressure from the United States drove potential partners directly into China's arms. The unintended consequence was that sanctions didn't isolate Venezuela. They integrated Venezuela more deeply into a Chinese-led economic sphere that operates parallel to and increasingly in competition with Western financial systems. This brings us to the crucial question: why does removing individual leaders never solve Venezuela's fundamental problems? The answer lies in understanding that Venezuela's crisis isn't about personalities. It's about structural dependence on oil revenue that creates perverse incentives for any government. Imagine you become president of Venezuela tomorrow. You inherit a government that depends on oil revenue for 90% of its budget. You face declining production capacity, aging infrastructure, depleted technical expertise, massive external debt, and social expectations created by decades of oil-funded programs. Your options are extremely limited. You can try to restore production, but that requires technical expertise that was fired, foreign investment that was scared away, and infrastructure that was neglected. You can try to diversify the economy, but that takes decades and requires reducing oil dependence gradually while oil revenue pays for the transition. Most likely, you'll face the same pressures that shaped your predecessors' decisions: the need to maintain government revenue to prevent social collapse, the temptation to use oil wealth for short-term political gains, the difficulty of building competitive industries when oil exports provide easy money. This is why the resource curse is so pernicious. The wealth is real, but the wealth creates dependency, and dependency creates vulnerability. As long as oil revenue is the only revenue that matters, as long as the government controls that revenue, as long as political power is tied to access to oil wealth, the same dynamics will repeat regardless of who holds office. Want to see how resource wealth can be managed differently? Look at Norway, which discovered massive North Sea oil reserves in the 1960s but chose a completely different development path. Norway created a sovereign wealth fund, the Government Pension Fund Global, that invests oil revenues in international financial markets rather than spending them immediately. Today, this fund is worth over $1.4 trillion and generates returns that will sustain Norway's economy long after its oil is depleted. Norway also maintains strict fiscal rules that limit government spending of oil revenues to roughly 4% annually, the expected real return on the fund's investments. This prevents boom-bust cycles tied to oil price volatility and ensures that oil wealth benefits future generations rather than just current politicians. Most importantly, Norway never allowed oil to dominate its economy. Manufacturing, shipping, technology, and services remained competitive. Educational investments created human capital that could generate prosperity independent of resource extraction. The contrast with Venezuela couldn't be more stark. Norway used oil wealth to build sustainable prosperity. Venezuela consumed oil wealth as fast as it could be extracted. Botswana provides another example. Despite having some of the world's largest diamond reserves, Botswana avoided the resource curse by maintaining diversified revenue sources, investing resource wealth in education and infrastructure, and building institutions that couldn't be easily captured by any individual leader or political faction. These examples demonstrate that resource wealth doesn't inevitably lead to dysfunction. But managing resource wealth successfully requires deliberate policy choices, strong institutions, and the political will to resist short-term pressures. Venezuela's crisis has broader implications for understanding how resource competition shapes international relations in the 21st century. First, it demonstrates the limits of economic sanctions as a policy tool. In a multipolar world with multiple buyers for any commodity, cutting off access to one market doesn't eliminate the market. It redirects trade flows and creates opportunities for competitors. Second, it shows how resource wealth becomes a focal point for great power competition. The contest between the United States and China isn't just about military capabilities or technological dominance. It's about access to energy, control over supply chains, and influence over resource-rich nations. Third, it illustrates how resource dependency makes countries vulnerable to external pressure, but also creates incentives for those countries to seek protection from rival powers. Venezuela's alignment with China isn't ideological, it's survival strategy. Fourth, it reveals how domestic governance failures in resource-rich countries can have regional and global consequences. Venezuelan migration has destabilized neighboring countries. Reduced Venezuelan oil production has affected global energy markets. The crisis has provided openings for criminal organizations, terrorist groups, and hostile state actors. So what would it take for Venezuela to break the resource curse and build sustainable prosperity? First, economic diversification. Venezuela would need to develop competitive industries independent of oil revenue. This requires massive investments in education, technology, infrastructure, and institutional capacity, investments that take decades to mature. Second, institutional reform. Venezuela would need to create government institutions that serve citizens rather than whoever controls oil revenue. This means tax systems based on productive economic activity, regulatory frameworks that encourage competition, and political systems that reward competence rather than loyalty. Third, resource management reform. Venezuela would need to restructure PDVSA as a commercial enterprise focused on maximizing long-term value rather than funding short-term political projects. This means reinvesting profits in infrastructure, hiring based on technical qualifications, and operating according to commercial rather than political logic. Fourth, international reintegration. Venezuela would need to rebuild relationships with international partners, attract foreign investment, and rejoin global financial systems. This requires political stability, policy predictability, and credible commitments to honoring contracts and protecting property rights. These changes are theoretically possible, but practically extremely difficult. Resource dependency creates powerful constituencies that benefit from the current system. Oil wealth generates corruption networks that resist reform. Political competition focuses on controlling resource revenue rather than building productive capacity. More fundamentally, breaking resource dependency requires sacrificing short-term benefits for long-term gains, a choice that's politically difficult in any democracy, but especially challenging in a country facing immediate humanitarian needs. Venezuela's tragedy isn't that it has too much oil, it's that oil wealth prevented the development of everything else. For a century, immense resource wealth allowed Venezuelan governments to avoid building competitive institutions, productive industries, or sustainable economic foundations. When oil prices were high, this worked. The government could distribute wealth, fund social programs, and maintain political stability through resource revenues alone. But when prices fell or production declined, the entire system collapsed because there was nothing else supporting it. This crisis will continue in one form or another until Venezuela breaks its dependence on oil revenue. New leaders may improve governance, foreign intervention may restore production, international assistance may address humanitarian needs. But unless the underlying economic structure changes, the same vulnerabilities will persist. Understanding Venezuela matters because it's not unique. Countries around the world depend on single commodities for government revenue. The same dynamics that destroyed Venezuelan prosperity threaten other resource-dependent nations. As climate change accelerates the global transition away from fossil fuels, as great powers compete for control over critical minerals, as resource wealth continues to shape international relations, Venezuela's experience provides crucial lessons about the relationship between natural resources and political stability. The question isn't whether Venezuela will recover, it's whether Venezuela will learn to prosper without oil. History suggests that's unlikely, but it's not impossible. The path exists. The question is whether Venezuela has the political will to take it. That's the real challenge facing Venezuela. Not managing oil wealth, but transcending dependence on it entirely. Until that happens, the crisis will continue, the patterns will repeat, and the structural forces that created this disaster will remain in place, waiting to create the next one. Thank you for watching The Strategic Context. I'm Professor Nouriel Bremer, reminding you that in geopolitics, the most important questions aren't about what's happening. They're about why it was always going to happen.